elsewhere as well, it appears. The United States, in conjunction with key allies, presumably the United Kingdom, is running an invisible network of prisons and detention centers into which thousands of suspects have disappeared without trace since the War on Terror began, writes British journalist and terrorism specialist Jason Burke, including a Soviet-era compound in Eastern Europe, Dana Priest. Their fate is unknown, but not hard to guess. In addition, unknown numbers of suspects have been sent by rendition to countries where torture is virtually guaranteed. In a scathing, comprehensive review of the doctrines created by Bush's Justice Department, international law professor Jordan Paust writes, "Not since the Nazi era have so many lawyers been so clearly involved in international crimes concerning the treatment and interrogation of persons detained during war." The lawyers were executing a plan that emerged within the Bush administration in 2002 to violate customary and treaty-based international law concerning the treatment and interrogation of so-called terrorist and enemy combatant detainees and their supporters. Paust notes that the common plan and authorizations have criminal implications, including violations of the laws of war, which are war crimes, and possible high-level conspiracy to commit such crimes. The Gonzales memo of 2002, according to Paust, is evidence of an unprincipled plan to evade the reach of law and to take actions in violation of Geneva law while seeking to avoid criminal sanctions. Similarly, a memo issued by Bush on February 7, 2002, necessarily authorized and ordered violations of the Geneva Conventions, which are war crimes. Reviewing subsequent presidential decisions, Paust finds violations of the Geneva Conventions and the Charter of the Nuremberg Tribunal, all war crimes, as well as flagrant violations of the U.S. Constitution. Paust is derisive of the efforts of judicial advisers, among them highly respected professors of law and other legal authorities, who engaged in complete fabrication and clear falsehood, distorting long-standing legal principles and Supreme Court judgments in the plans to permit war crimes. He can recall no precedent in U.S. history for such crimes by lawyers and at the highest levels of our government, including the President and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, who ordered practices patently violative of the laws of war. The two major international human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have vigorously affirmed the Nuremberg principle of highest-level responsibility for crimes against peace and crimes against humanity. Referring to the scandal of Guantanamo and resort to torture directly or through the shameful practice of rendition, Human Rights Watch called for criminal investigations of Donald Rumsfeld and former CIA Director George Tenet, along with Generals Ricardo Sanchez, the former top U.S. military commander in Iraq, and Jeffrey Miller, the former commander of the Guantanamo prison camp. Amnesty International called on all governments of the world to carry out criminal investigations of senior U.S. officials involved in the torture scandal, and if the investigations support prosecution, to arrest any official who enters their territory and begin legal proceedings against that official, following the precedent of the prosecution of Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet, in conformity with the directives of international humanitarian law. The common reaction in U.S. elite circles was predictable, given their reflexive rejection of the most elementary moral truisms and the accompanying doctrine of self-exemption from international law and treaties. Even without detailed information about the criminal practices of Bush and associates in Guantanamo, few could have been in any doubt that it is the site of major atrocities. Condoleezza Rice's solemn assurances to European diplomats about torture and rendition can hardly be taken seriously. Why select Egypt for rendition, not Sweden? Why detain people in Guantanamo rather than in a prison in New York? The pretext that dangerous terrorists might have escaped in New York is without merit. Evidently, the Bush administration selected Guantanamo because legalistic chicanery could portray it as exempt from domestic or international law. The U.S. base in eastern Cuba was seized by force at the end of the 19th century, and then given to the United States under an imposed treaty that permits it to be used as a coaling or naval station. It has since been converted to other purposes, in violation of even that forced concession by occupied Cuba, among them the detention of Haitian refugees in violation of Article 9 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and now torture and other violations of international law. Maintaining the U.S. base is also a transparent effort to undermine the Cuban economy by denying the country its major port and possibilities for development in the hinterland. In unintended confirmation of the assessment of Bush administration doctrine by Levinson, Paust, and the human rights organizations, two legal authorities have sought to dismiss another convention of international humanitarian law. The designation of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, as the sole authority to determine the status of prisoners of war. This convention is ludicrous. We learn from international lawyers Lee Casey and David Rivkin, who served in the Justice Department under Reagan and Bush I. One reason is that each state is entitled to interpret international law itself. This is the essence of sovereignty and self-government. The phrase each state refers, of course, to the United States or its clients, if Washington chooses to delegate the rights to them. Casey and Rivkin do not conclude, for example, that Saddam Hussein was entitled to interpret the law so as to authorize his conquest of Kuwait, or that a future democratic government in Iraq would be entitled to bomb Israel to put an end to its violation of innumerable Security Council orders, as well as of the Geneva Conventions. A second reason the ICRC is disqualified is that it disagrees with Washington and has thereby abdicated its role as an impartial humanitarian body, QED. Casey and Rivkin could have added others to their list of disqualified authorities, among them the Organization of American States, OAS, and the spear carrier for the Pax Americana, as the Blair government is described with scorn in Britain's leading journal of international affairs. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights of the OAS requested in March 2002 that the United States take the urgent measures necessary to have the legal status of the detainees at Guantanamo Bay determined by a competent tribunal, meaning the ICRC. Washington dismissed the request on grounds that it has no binding commitment to accept the Commission's decisions. Perhaps with this in mind, a year later, the OAS for the first time voted to exclude the United States from membership in the Inter-American Commission, a symbolic rebuff to show our disapproval of U.S. policies, a Latin American diplomat in Washington observed. As for Britain, the Blair government refused to take a stand when a British court of appeal ruled unanimously that Feroz Abbasi, a British citizen held without charge at Guantanamo, was being detained arbitrarily in a legal black hole, invoking rights that trace back to quaint provisions of the Magna Carta. These provisions were, at last, partially recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court in its Rasool et al. Versus Bush decision of June 2004, perhaps also disqualifying the Supreme Court by Casey and Rivkin's standards, though not Congress, which nullified the ruling in fall 2005. Among other institutions disqualified from judging U.S. actions are the World Court, ever since it ruled against the United States in the case brought by Nicaragua in 1986, and the UN Security Council, which affirmed the World Court's judgment. But the World Court's iniquity extends beyond its transgression on Nicaragua. In July 2004, the court issued an advisory ruling that Israel's separation wall, dividing the West Bank, violates international law, and that it is an obligation for all states not to recognize the illegal situation